Deanne, let's get started. Just give me a second. I want to run through a little bit of how we got to this point. I know some of you have attended a number of these webinars. I know others of you, this is your first one attending. So let me run through where we got to this. We decided at the beginning of the pandemic that one of the things that Leger does well is obviously provide information. So how can we provide information? We have our weekly COVID tracker. If you don't already have that being sent to you every week, please feel free to log into leger360.com and we will get you a copy of that. It's a survey of Canadians and Americans looking at how we are handling throughout this, and then we're adding in other public affairs topics. This week there's some questions on police and what Americans and Canadians believe about the future of police. We have, this is our 8th or 9th webinar. I lost count. It is our last one, at least for the summer. We think that people are starting to get a little webinared out, and so that's why I very much appreciate all of you that are here today. If you had not attended one of the past ones, everything is available. The recordings are all available on our website as well. So just a quick run through. We started with Dr. Terry Flynn from the McMaster Masters of Communication Management program. And we talked about how organizations should plan for crises, should be prepared for it, and how they should start to communicate in the midst of it. It's a great discussion around for anyone who wants to set up a crisis management plan within their organization. We followed with Dr. Alan Middleton talking about how brands should be responding during this time and what type of communications and discussion do we expect as Canadians, and should brands be delivering. Next, we talked with Dr. Jacques Nantel about, and this was in the early days, how retail has changed forever. And we're going to go talk now with Diane about 6 weeks later about where retail is at now. Dr. Alex Sevigny from McMaster joined me for the next one, discussing social media, digital platforms, what does it mean, how things are changing, and how are we looking at social media in a different way when we're all locked up in our houses, and how has our use of social media changed. Tina McCorkindale from the Institute for Public Relations joined me for the next one, looking at internal communications, and we have done a survey with the Institute for Public Relations looking at employee engagement during this, which is going to be released on IPR and Leger's website next Tuesday. But basically, we looked at how are employers communicating with their staff and how are employees' expectations of their employers' communications. Then one of the areas of our industry that's been impacted significantly through this is post-secondary education. So we had the Chief Communications Officer at Sheridan College, Christine Sesejcik, join us to talk about how do you communicate and change and pivot and do all these things when you have students in class, international students, and people signing on for next year's programs. Then we had Meredith Maxwell, who's with the Niagara region of public health, and it was a really interesting discussion around how do you communicate and get people to follow directions. And there's been some talk about Canada has done very well at social distancing or physical distancing and following the rules. And a lot of that is attributed to the wonderful work that our public health program has done. So we talked about those aspects. And then last week we had Dr. McDonald from Dalhousie on talking about vaccines and sort of the fake news that can be accompanying vaccines that limits people's getting vaccines, and how do we address that as communicators, and how do we get around that as we start to talk about new vaccines being released. Which brings me to today. Welcome, Diane. Thank you for joining. Let me introduce you for the people who don't know who you are. Diane Brisebois is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Retail Council of Canada. She's been in that position since 1995. Retail Council is the largest retail association in the country, representing more than 45,000 retail establishments of all shapes and sizes from coast to coast. Covers all retail segments, including general merchandise, fashion, grocery, and pharmacy, and accounts for more than 70% of all retails in the country, excluding auto and gas. Diane is well decorated. She has the Pinnacle Award in recognition of exceptional leadership and outstanding contribution to the association community and the Canadian Society of Association Executives. She has the Advancing Retail as a Career Award from the School of Retailing at the University of Alberta, the Golden Pencil Award from the Food Industry of Canada for outstanding contribution to the grocery industry, the Founders of Canada's Digital Economy Award, presented by Identity North in recognition of outstanding contribution to the advancement of the digital economy, and recently the Star Women Award presented by the grocery and CPG industries in recognition of outstanding leadership in the industry. Welcome, Diane, to our Leger webinar. Glad you could join us.
My pleasure, David. My pleasure.
Good. So let's just start general for a second. So much has changed in the retail space, and so much is continuing to change. How is the health of retail in Canada at this point?
You know, it's a tale of two cities. It's healthy if you look at essential retailers, and that's generally grocery and pharma, but it does include other categories. And it is slow and tenuous in other categories, so what we would call discretionary spending or non-essential. And David, that's for several reasons, but the main reason is that, as most of your listeners would know, a great number of retailers had to be closed for the greater part of 3 months. And we're only surviving with online sales. And then further down the road, we're able to do, curbside pickup. And then just gradually, we're able to open all their stores in Quebec and Ontario. We're just Ontario. In fact, Quebec has announced the reopening of malls, and we're expecting to hear some news from Ontario. So because of that, it has been extremely difficult for most of the non-food, non-essential retailers. The light at the end of the tunnel is getting closer, so to speak. We're hearing some positive feedback generally that customers are going back to shopping, not only shopping online for discretionary spending, but also in store. But we may differ from the Bank of Canada in believing that the recovery is going to be much slower than expected, especially in the retail sector. So that's where we stand at this time.
Well, because even as the stores start to open, there's going to be such restrictions on how many people can be in that store. How many, and for some stores, I know a number of stores were able to pick up online shopping and get that, but not everyone was able to do that, especially some of the smaller retailers, I would imagine. So are we looking at, as recovery is slow, are retailers excited about being able to reopen, or is there still a certain amount of dread as to how am I going to pay next month's rent at this point?
It's, I would say it falls in two camps, and you described them well. The one camp is small retailers. They are struggling with very few exceptions. And for some, fortunately, they embraced e-commerce. You know, they joined platforms like Shopify, for example, or eBay, whatever the platform may be, are more advanced than others in their e-commerce journey. But for the great majority of small retailers, we all know, and I think your listeners do as well, they have been slow at adapting e-commerce or even developing a digital presence. So for them, it is very much about survival. The Conference Board of Canada and the Chamber of Commerce did some research, and it showed the amount of cash that most small to mid-sized businesses have on hand and for how long. And looking deeper into retail, it showed that most small retailers have had no more than about 3 weeks of cash to operate. So it's very much a day-to-day business. So you can appreciate if you're closed for 3 months, you have no rent, you barely have any online business. This is really about survival. The inventory for those retailers who, let's not forget, the challenge here, a lot of people forget this, there are a lot of retailers who fall in the seasonal category. So you go 3 months with inventory, and by the time you may be able to reopen your store, your inventory is outdated. So you are discounting, if you can even do that. And that means you need to try to get new inventory. And in most cases, what we're concerned about is those small businesses did not have money to pay rent. They were fortunate enough to get subsidies to support themselves a bit and support some of their employees, because most of them have less than 10 employees. But everything else was dried out because there was no cash. I mean, no sales, no revenue, no money to buy new inventory, to do whatever you need to keep your store fresh and relevant. So look, these are estimates, but based on the numbers we've seen from other sectors who are intertwined with retail, so the greater service sector, we are estimating that by mid next year, so end of second quarter of 2020, we will have lost about 30% of our small retailers in Canada. So that is going to have a huge impact on Main Street, on communities, both neighborhoods in urban centers and those vibrant communities in centers outside of the urban core. Many of them, let's not forget, many of those smaller retailers that are in, for example, cottage country areas across the country.
Oh, yeah.
See, so we don't think about that, but we think, okay, the store is now open. The issue is not just the store is open, are there customers? And if 50% of your customers are because they have cottages, or because of tourism, or because of festivals, concerts, that is the greater challenge. And that's where there hasn't been enough discussion. So we're doing a lot of work in we're working with the tourism sector, hotel sectors, and others to look at their impact, the impact on their business, and what that means to retail. Because when we're thinking, and I'm sure that when you had conversations with other guests on retail, we're talking often about, oh, the poor small retailer, and then we're talking about the big retailers and how they're going to be doing. We do really have to separate retail in two categories. The retailers who depend on spending from customers on a regular basis, be it discretionary or essential goods, and those who have most of their footprint in urban centers. And then you have all the rest who have or their entire footprint in what we call tourist zones, or have part of their footprints in those tourist zones. So they get a double whammy, because that recovery, as we all know, is going to be slow. I mean, who's thinking of getting on a plane? You can't travel to the US. The US can't travel to Canada. So think Mont-Tremblant in Quebec, think Niagara on the Lake. Also think about the cruise ships. A lot of the Vancouver retailers work extremely well because of the cruise ship business, or restaurants, for example. So all of that is what we're starting to see. So, when we're talking about phase 2 in COVID, we're talking about phase 2 in retail recovery. And phase 2 looks very, very different for different types of retailers because of the kind of customers they rely on to make sure that their business is strong. And a lot of those who fall in the tourism sector have not invested heavily in digital and in online sales. So they're even more at risk.
If someone's coming off a cruise ship, they're not going online to buy something when they get there. It's what's impulse. It's what's there. It's what they're going to see and pick up in that shop. You're absolutely right.
Talk about duty-free stores. Talk about all the stores in airports.
Yeah.
We forget about that, but a lot of retailers have substantial investments and footprints in those types of environments. And so that's where we see the biggest risk in regards to, creditor protection or in fact bankruptcies. And we have seen a lot of smaller retailers, especially family businesses. And I know that many of the listeners have seen that also in the media, where they've just said, you know, we're going to close. We just can't continue, and it's too much. So those are the unknown, because they don't make the headlines, but we're hearing more about those now.
Okay. Is there anything good that you're seeing come out of this? Is there anything positive that we can take out of this for the next little while from a retail standpoint? You're shaking your head. No?
Yeah, no. I'm just happy you asked me that question, because I always seem to be the bearer of bad news. And you know, for your listeners, excuse me, let me say that you know, they're in a crisis. There's always opportunity. It sounds strange saying that, because this has been such a difficult crisis in so many ways, but there is opportunity and there is silver lining. In fact, I think just before the call, I was telling you, David, that I was having a fabulous conversation with Brian Heel, the founder and CEO of Aritzia, a very well-known fashion brand, a Canadian brand that has stores in North America. And there are a couple of things he said, and I suspect also that Professor Nantel may have mentioned that in previous webinar with you. The retailers who are looking at this and say, boy, this is going to be tough, but there are opportunities here. How do I use this crisis to make our organization better and to ramp it up faster? And so Brian said, we're looking at this year as being 2023 and next year 2025. This is where we were planning to be 5 years from now. This has got to happen now. So during the crisis, they, instead of slowing down their technology investment, their analytical investments, so their data investments, their AI, augmented reality investments, they in fact ramped up. And what they have done, and I've heard that from other retailers, is a question that is asked often, and I suspect it would be a question on the listener's mind, is, you know, what will the role of online be versus brick and mortar? And what Brian was saying is that, you know, we think our stores are going to be extremely important. In fact, we are going to be opening more brick and mortar stores. But this is what we're doing. We have always been a fashion retailer for women, so specifically apparel. But we've been asked often, why don't you sell shoes? Why don't you sell swimwear? So what they're doing is they're experimenting online. So they're using their online platform to introduce specific assortments that they don't have in their store, because it is much more difficult to introduce that in a brick and mortar, because you have to change the store, redesign the store, you know, and it's inventory, so it's very costly. So what they are doing is they are getting a lot of feedback from customers, and they are trying those lines and piloting those lines online to see if, in fact, there's traction, if there's interest, if there are sales. And then with that data, figuring out which of those experiments can then be transferred to the brick and mortar experience to add more, increase traffic, increase size of basket, and so on and so forth. So in fact, it's kind of the other way around, you know, where everyone was said brick and mortar is going online. Now these brilliant retailers are seeing online as a school, as what will teach them to be better in a brick and mortar environment. So I think that, you know, number one, e-commerce has jumped 5 years in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
Continue to grow. We do not believe it will grow at the same speed it did during the 3 months, but it will continue to be an extremely important platform. And we think that because of what retailers are going to be learning online, and because the need for us to socialize, the retail stores will still continue to exist, but they will be transformed. One, because of COVID, social distancing, and all of that, but two, because most of the smart retailers are realizing their store or their media platforms. That's where they can do a lot of really, really cool stuff to build their brand, their community, and to personalize that experience, and to then ensure that their customers are comfortable on all their platforms.
That makes sense. For those who are listening in, there is a questions tab on your right. If you have any questions, please feel free to click on it and write it out, and I will ask to Deanne. And we have a question from Kathleen right now, Deanne. We're talking about what positive outcomes could come out of this. Do you anticipate that Canadians might change their shopping habits to purchase more often from smaller businesses or Canadian-owned businesses? I mean, you look at the Blue program in Quebec. We look at Shop Main Street versus Big Mall. Like, are you going to see more of those types of programs? And do you think Canadians will go along with that?
Yeah, I do think that that is, and thank you for that question, because I would have been remiss not mentioning it. That is, to me, one of the biggest transformative change that we will see going forward. I don't believe that these organizations like Panier Bleu, Main Street, in fact, we also have a campaign, as others do. I don't think that those are just the flavor of the period. I do believe that a lot of things have changed in the way we're going to shop, and one of them will be feeling more responsible about where we shop and what we buy. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be conscious about how much we pay, that we're not going to continue shopping around, that we're not going to shop from Amazon or any other platform. But I do believe as consumers, we will be much more conscious of the role that those small businesses or smaller stores play in our community. It's not that we've taken them for granted, but we haven't understood how much they're integrated in the vibrancy of our street fronts. And I think it's going to also help, because a lot of the cities, and Montreal is a perfect example, we're seeing it in Toronto and in Vancouver and other parts of the country. The cities are transforming themselves to have more bike paths and more walking paths. So as in Montreal, where a lot of the streets will be closed, that while some people think this will not be good for business, we believe in the long run it will be, and it will be extremely good for smaller businesses that may not have the resources to have a huge digital presence or a huge marketing budget to be able to reach a bigger audience. So the way the cities are transforming themselves will also have a huge impact in the way we shop and where we shop going forward.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about the Retail Council itself for a second. You're representing more than 45,000 retailers. Think back 6 months ago, what are you doing differently now than you were 6 months ago? I mean, as an organization, you've obviously had to refocus. What are you doing differently now?
I think the answer to that would be, what are we not doing differently? As I'm sure your listeners know, most big trade associations, certainly the good ones, do a lot of advocacy work, government relations, representing their sector, speaking to all levels of government, trying to get rid of red tape, try to ensure that there's a strong economy. And apart from that, we do a lot of education, a lot of training, a lot of research. But obviously, the moment we saw what was happening in Asia, and as we were following the World Health Organization advisories, we knew that this was going to be very serious. So we quickly developed a crisis plan, and basically we have been working 24/7 in being the voice of retail at all levels of government, so they better understand how to develop the funding programs that they've introduced, so that in fact it serves the community that it was targeted for or targeted to serve. So we have been doing, we have a large government relations team full time, and I thank God every day for having done that many years ago. And they have been the, our bread and butter and our members' bread and butter. things were happening so quickly, retailers just couldn't keep track. The programs, the wage subsidies, the CERB program, it's an alphabet list of programs. It was so difficult, even for the larger retailers, to understand, how do I apply for that? How does it work? Does it work for these employees, those employees? So basically, we became the base of all the information, analyzing everything, and also providing a lot of advice. We developed with the Boston Consulting Group probably the first in-depth retail recovery playbook, which provided all the information that retailers needed during the crisis and to prepare for the recovery. And that is what we focused on. We focused on resources that would help them manage this crisis. And we made sure that that information was just in time. So we had to learn, like a lot of businesses, to be much more digitally focused, to use technology. And, technology became our friend, and to also get the information out in a way that it was understood to retailers. So even learned to change our language so that it was less government speak, less technical, but very much retail. Okay, this is your reality. This is what it means. This is how you do it. And we continue. We're still in that mode, even though that we're dealing with different kinds of issues. But we needed to make sure that we were the reliable source for retailers and support for retailers, and the reliable and authentic voice for them to all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal.
Okay. This question comes from Lindsay, and it sort of goes back to the Main Street program a bit, but from a little different angle. Have you seen any evidence of retailers using this pandemic in ways to innovate in sustainability and green programs?
Oh, yeah.
Do you see shifts like that starting to happen?
Yes, we are seeing shifts like that, and for several reasons. In some cases, it's because the enterprise, the company, wanted to do it and decided that that would be their focus towards the recovery. In other cases, it's external. It was externally forced, and by that, let me explain that. With the crisis, it wasn't just retailers and restaurants and hotels and airlines that were affected. The supply chain was affected. With a lot of retailers, their vendors were in trouble. Their vendors could not produce anymore. And for a lot of retailers, the vendors are outside of Canada. So it forced retailers to start thinking about, how do I source locally? How can I start developing partnerships and source from closer to home and have a more reliable supply chain? And with that, there was more attention paid to, how can I reduce my carbon footprint? How can I look at ways so that I am more conscious of the environment? And are there products that I can buy that are sustainable? And then we've seen this with the grocery sector. Grocery sector in Canada has been amazing, and I don't think people appreciate how much better it is than in a lot of other countries around the world. But it has, both small and large grocers have worked for many years to develop local relationships with local growers, local producers, with consumer products manufacturers that are in the region. Quebec is spectacular for that. I wish that all the other provinces looked at what the province of Quebec and the government does to support local businesses, because it helps them, it helps economic growth, but it also helps in the supply chain. So we're getting a lot of questions from retailers about who should they go to, how could they search for those types of suppliers. But we're also even seeing it with retailers when they're looking at their footprint, lighting, for example, the kind of fabrics they use for their counters. A lot of them are looking at reusable, recycled material. So I think, there are a lot of things, David, that will come out of this crisis, which will become part and parcel of our lifestyle. And the silver lining there is that many of them are very good. And one of them is sustainability.
Okay.
And so that's one. Two is an attention to mental health. You know, mental health was kind of the cancer of the 50s that nobody talked about. Like it was, and mental health has been like that for a very long time. And it has been pushed to the surface, is all of us have had to deal with being isolated and feeling anxiety, some depression. And all of a sudden we're much more aware that that's real for all of us.
Yeah.
And so we're much more respectful and attentive. So there are a lot of interesting things coming out of this crisis that I think may very well make us as a society more responsible, more attentive, and more aware.
Okay. The third, I would add a third one to that. Maybe you would disagree, but it's about cleanliness and about how the stores are going to be reacting to that. In terms of cleaning, in terms of masks, gloves, cost of sanitizer, a question from Patrick here is, are you going to see those costs? Are retailers looking at passing those costs on to customers, or is it something that they are just going to absorb right now? Or is there any discussion about how to, you have to change. You have to make new changes to your store. It all costs money. So is that going to be passed on, do you think?
So first part of my answer is that health and safety is the new black. So that is here to stay. So regardless if it's physical distancing or cleaning surfaces, wearing gloves or wearing a visor or facial covering, this is very much going to be part and parcel of our lifestyles for a very long time, maybe modified as we go, but it will be important. In regards to how retailers are handling the additional cost around PPE, around all of the equipment they've had to purchase, right now, very few of them are in any position to pass on those costs to consumers. But eventually, I suspect as those cost increases, the cost, part of those costs will have to be passed on.
Yeah,
I mean, it is a formula. There's a percentage of your cost that's built into your price, as you know. Then there's margins, profit margins, and the like. So, it will vary because it will depend on the size of the retailer, on the amount of PPE that they require going forward. But it's not a definitive answer, but it gives you a sense of where they stand right now.
Okay. I have another question from Michael here about occupations in demand within the retail sector. Is that something else? Will technical roles become more important as e-commerce grows? Is the world, the employment landscape of retail also changing in respects to all of this from your perspective?
Yes, it will. I don't think as drastically as we think it will, but yes, there are areas where we're already seeing a demand for specific competency. We just finished talking about this, health and safety, occupational health. That used to be, often a junior position in a mid or large size company. It's now being pushed to the top. So we see that. We see a great demand in digital skills. So on coding, technology, but we're also seeing a lot of demand on the marketing. But we're talking, modern, what we call modern marketing. So we will continue to see growth. We're also seeing a lot of demand for people who have analytical skills. The other area where we've been asked quite a few questions is those soft skills. Because keep in mind that the sales associate of the future may need to have different skills, may need to be much more empathetic, may need to be able to read the customer's level of anxiety or comfort in an environment. Those are not the skills we've taught sales associates. It's about selling, it's about upselling, It's about welcoming. It's about understanding the product. It's about product knowledge. So that's why I'm suggesting that it's not that those jobs will be replaced in large numbers, is that those jobs now will require very different skills. And those soft emotional skills are going to be much more important as we move through the recovery and we move to post-COVID era.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left, but I just got a couple of questions that are really good, so I want to ask them to you. When we look at e-commerce, a common complaint is how expensive shipping is. Do you see, in your work, how are the shipping companies, is there an opportunity to have them lower rates to assist retailers coming out of this, or is there going to be more volume leading to lower rates? Do you see anything changing in that?
Absolutely, great question, because the challenge in Canada for retailers is not just the cost of shipping and how much shippers charge. It's the fact that we have a very, very weak infrastructure. Right now, Canada Post still has, weeks of backlog. They weren't, the period, the COVID period, especially the first 6 weeks, was like 2 Christmases, 2 holiday seasons. And then they've had to deal with employees who were ill, but they don't have, think about Canada Post, which is the main shipping carrier for most online businesses in Canada. All of their distribution centers are built for people to be close to each other. The entire infrastructure is not built to allow for physical distancing. And so, so here we are building, retailers are spending all this money building their digital infrastructure, their online business, encouraging customers to use online, and the shipper cannot ship. And this is not going to go away. We are very concerned with that. And so that will have an impact on pricing, obviously. And we don't know when that will get better. There are, apart from Canada Post, we obviously have courier companies, but there isn't a big carrier like Canada Post to compete with Canada Post. So retailers and consumers are going to see quite a bit of friction for a while. I think it's still going to continue, being pricey for retailers going forward. Hopefully we can resolve that sooner versus later, but I don't suspect that that's going to be resolved in the next few months. I think there's a huge problem in Canada with the postal infrastructure and the delivery infrastructure, and that if there's anything that will slow down online shopping, it will be that, not the fact that retailers don't have enough, are not attractive enough online, or don't provide enough services and assortment and the likes online. That for retailers is going to be our greatest challenge.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. The last question is about contactless payment. We're shifting away from cash. We've done a number of studies recently for Payments Canada, and we've looked at how everything's shifting in terms of how we spend our money now. But there's still a $100 cap on tap. Is the Retail Council involved in talking to banks about increasing that, or Interact to increase that amount? Is there a way to make it easier for people to purchase without having to touch any payment pad? Or is that not on your radar yet?
Oh no, like you're getting me in the danger zone. I'm already not that popular with that community. So here we go. A few more darts on the wall. Look, we're very concerned that as you said, the limit went up to $250 for Visa MasterCard. And
I wasn't aware of that. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah. Okay.
So that's for credit. So that's the top. But for debit, which is the national system in Canada, is Interact. And I can tell you, for retailers, it's a hell of a lot cheaper if a customer taps with Interact than if they tap with Visa and MasterCard. But the banks sit on both sides of the fence. So if they get less money when you're using Interact than if you're using Visa, MasterCard, chances are they're going to want to keep Interact at 100 and Visa, MasterCard at 250. Now, some people will say, Diane, that is absolutely not true. Then prove it to me, because I do not believe otherwise. And if there is one thing we are passionate about that we are going to be fighting to, the end of time, is those merchant fees that our members are paying. Think about it. It has a lot of a good chunk of our business is moving online. The fees that retailers pay when you do an online purchase are even higher than when you're using that same card in store. So those
Really?
have increased substantially. I mean, substantially. And there is absolutely no reason. Apart from the US, we're pretty much the highest in the world. In the EU, they put a cap on those fees. And in Canada, we have been successful at Retail Council to force those fees to come down. But we are very concerned with the top limit of 100 for Interact. Also concerned with the fees that are charged for what we call card not present. So when you use your card online, that is costing our members lots of money. And there's absolutely no reason why it should. So there you go. I gave you my 5 minutes deal on that. I feel really passionate about that. And I will die on the sword to get those fees lowered for retailers, because at the end of the day, we as consumers end up paying for it. If it's
Exactly.
just much for the retailer to accept a payment online, then they've got to recoup that cost. And so that's a huge issue.
So it looks like we have some challenges in terms of getting shipments going out, getting costs to retailers down, and moving ahead.
That's why
Deanne,
the council was there. We're going to fight for it.
I'm glad you are. So thank you very much for today, Deanne. We're at the 45-minute mark. Thank you everyone for attending. We will be posting a recording of this if anyone came on late and wanted to hear the whole thing, or if you know someone else who might want to listen to it. And thank you for all of you who have attended a number of these sessions. And thanks, Diane, once again.
Hey, thank you, David. It was a pleasure joining you.
I'm glad. Take care.